Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about data and data types. So, what is data? Data is nothing but some value or some piece of information that you use in your program or that might be stored in your computer memory. So, let's look at some examples. So, here are some examples of what data would be. So, this name John might be used in your program somewhere or might be stored in your memory somewhere. This would be some data. Numbers like 32 or minus 4.215, these would also be data. Characters like S or percentage would also be data, right? So this is all there is to understand about what data actually is. Let's now talk about data types. So what are data types? Data types are just categories into which data is classified in. So data types are just a classification of data. Now, different programming languages deal with this classification differently. So instead of focusing on a specific programming language, we'll be discussing the basic data types that are common for all programming languages. So the basic data types can be thought of as three data types. The first one is numeric data, the second one is Boolean data, and the third one is text data. We'll be discussing these in detail now. So the numeric data type deals with numbers, all kinds of numbers. It is divided into two more data types. The first one is integers. So integers have numbers that do not have any decimals. For example, 32 or minus 256. These numbers would be integers. The second type of numeric data types is float. Float data types are numbers that do have decimals. For example, minus 4.666. This would be a float or a double data type. In some programming languages, integers or the integer data type is further classified into more data types based on the size of their magnitude. So if it has a really large magnitude, it would be classified as a long integer or a long int. If it has a shorter magnitude or a smaller magnitude, something like 26 only, it might be classified as a short int or short. Usually though, integer data types are specified by int, which covers a wide range of magnitudes. Now let's move on to the second type of data. This is called Boolean data. Boolean data is really simple. It just takes two values, true or false. These are logical values and not just strings. This means that if you want to logically say that some statement is true or some statement is false, you might want to store this true value or false value in your program. This true value is of a Boolean data type. This false value also of a Boolean data type. That's all. The next type of data is text data. Now, text data is further classified into characters and strings. Characters are just single Unicode characters like capital A or small c or the percentage sign or even a space. Strings is a sequence of characters like hello world or John. Since characters and strings are so interrelated in their definition, most programming languages implement them in terms of one another. For example, some programming languages think of strings as a sequence of characters, and that's how strings are implemented. Other programming languages think of characters as strings of unit length, and that's how characters are implemented. Now, that is all we had to discuss about the different types of data. So now that we've covered all the basic data types, let's think about why we even have to do this classification in the first place. Why use data types? The reason for this is that we'll explicitly be stating in our program which type of data it is that we're using whenever we want to use some data in our program. Why do we have to explicitly state which type of data we are using here? This is because it lets the compiler or the computer know two important things. The first one is that the data that you have, it will let the computer know what kind of values it should be allowed to take. For example, if I say uh, that I want to use some data and that is going to be of the float data type, right? Now if I try to say that this data is W, the data that I wanted to use, this is going to throw an error, right? Because W doesn't fall in the allowed values for the float data type. Float is a numeric data type that has decimals allowed in it, and W isn't even a numeric, right? So that won't be allowed. A second example is that in Java, the int data type only has allowed values from minus 2 to the power 31 till 2 to the power 31 minus 1. So for the int data type, it can only have integers that fall within this range. So if I try to say that, if I try to let the computer know by explicitly stating in my program that I'm going to be using some data and that's going to be of the type integer. And then I try to say that 128 is this data that I'm using. It's going to allow it because 128 is a int. It falls in that range. But if I try to say that 2 to the power 32 is this int that I want to use, that's not going to work because 2 to the power 32 actually is not an int because it doesn't fall in this range. 2 to the power 32 is an integer. It is an integer in the mathematical sense, but in Java it doesn't fall in the range of int. So for this you might have to use some other integer data type like long int, which allows such huge values. The second and a very important point that data types let the compiler know about is what kind of operations can be done on this data. For example, if I have two integers, 4 and 2, the compiler knows that these are integers because I've explicitly stated this. Now if I tell the compiler to perform a subtraction operation between them, it will successfully be able to do that, right? Because logically, subtraction is a valid operation for integers. But if I say that I have two strings, John and bag, and now I ask the compiler to perform a subtraction operation between them, this is obviously going to give an error because the compiler knows that integers can be subtracted, but strings can't be subtracted, right? So if I define something as a string, if I define my data and classify it as a string, I'm letting the compiler know that this data cannot be a part of a subtraction operation. If I specify some data as integer, I'm letting the compiler know that this data can be a part of a subtraction operation. So that's what I mean by data types. Specifying data types explicitly in your program lets the compiler know what operations can be done on this data. So that's all about data and data types. Thank you for watching. If you have any doubts or any comments, please feel free to leave them below the video. Thank you.